Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Mourning in Malmö by Torquil MacLeod. Narrated by Marguerite Gavin. Prologue. The ship lurched. The crossing had been getting progressively rougher. Jens Ullman knew that he should have gone to his cabin when his two friends, David and Sven, had retired for the night. But he was enjoying the company of the young Estonian man Romet in the Admiral bar. Romet turned out to be a fledgling electrical engineer who was studying in Stockholm and was keen to hear about Jens's experiences at Electrolux. As Jens wobbled over with another drink from the bar, this would definitely be the last. He noticed that it was nearly 1 o'clock in the morning. He wasn't bothered. The drink and convivial conversation were warding off the seasickness he'd felt a couple of hours after their slightly late 1915 departure from Tallin. Romet thanked Jens for the beer. The waves were crashing against the windows. There weren't many other drinkers left, though a bunch of Swedes were still noisily making the most of the end of their holiday. Jens hoped that they'd have time to recover before going back to work. He himself had the rest of the week off. "Have you got a family?" Romet asked. Like all the questions he posed, it sounded as though he was genuinely interested in the answer. "Yes, 1 daughter and 1 grandson," Jens said with pride. "They live in Lund. My son-in-law, Bjorn, lectures at the university. English. I think he's what you call an academic high flyer. He'll do well. Is your daughter at home?" "No. Anita was off work for a while after she had Lasse, but she's back now. She's in the police." "The police?" Romet said with surprise. His experience of the Estonian police in the recent pre-independence days had not been good. "Yes. I've no idea why she went in for it. Enjoys it, though." Jens fished a photograph from his wallet. He held it out for Romet to inspect. It was a close-up of a family group, a young blonde boy sitting between his parents. "I didn't think policewomen could be so attractive," Romet found himself saying, the drink having loosened his tongue. She had shoulder-length blonde hair parted in the middle. Her high cheekbones were accentuated by the spectacles she wore, framing bright, laughing eyes. The mouth was shapely, the lips not too thin. It was a mouth that was used to creasing into a smile. She looked truly happy. "Sorry," Romet quickly apologized. Jens gave him an indulgent grin. "That's okay. I think she's the most beautiful girl in the world. She can be strong-willed," he added as an afterthought. "Once she gets an idea into her head—" He took the photo back and looked at it. "Lasse's brought new meaning to my life. He'll be 4 in November." He shook his head in disbelief. "They grow so fast. You know, I was dreading being a grandfather. That melted away the moment I saw him." "They look like a contented couple," Romet remarked, hoping to atone for his earlier slip. "They are. Long may it last. I'm afraid Anita's mother and I haven't set them a very good example." "Separated?" "Divorced." "I'm sorry." Romet found himself apologizing again. The ferry gave another lurch, sending their drinks sliding across the table. Romet caught them both before they vanished, though the beer splashed onto the plastic surface. "Quick reflexes," said Jens with admiration. Romet smiled as he took out a handkerchief and wiped his fingers. "I play handball." The ferry suddenly rose and fell in quick succession. This time, Jens had his glass clasped in his hand. It was clear that Romet was nervous about the excessive movement. "Don't worry. These ships are well built. Wave collisions like this are just like turbulence on an aircraft. I've never flown." "Ah." Jens strained his glass. "I think it's time I made for my cabin." He got up and nearly stumbled as the ship rolled again. "Night, Romet. Maybe see you before we dock in Stockholm tomorrow." As Jens got to the bar door, he heard a loud bang. It was like an explosion, and it penetrated through the general hum of the ship. He steadied himself and made for the stairwell. He wasn't too worried. It would be something or nothing. But as the ship reared again, he was unbalanced and found himself tumbling down the narrow staircase. He was momentarily dazed. Recovering, he realized the ship had listed dramatically. It took him a moment to work out that the configuration of the corridor was all awry. Everything was tilted. He staggered to his feet. Something was seriously wrong. He must get to his cabin and warn his friends. The ship should have righted itself by now. As he wobbled along, cabin doors were swinging open at unnatural angles. Passengers began to emerge, most of them half asleep, many of them alarmed. He heard children crying. A woman screamed. The ferry groaned. He reached the next stairwell. People were desperately pushing their way upwards. He forced his way down the steps, but could hardly move when he reached the bottom. He tried to negotiate the constricted corridor full of yelling, terrified passengers. Another massive creaking and a further tilt lifted him off his feet. He landed awkwardly and felt a sharp pain in his ankle. He was pushed aside and he crashed through one of the cabin doors, which had now, owing to the list of the ship, become part of the floor. Winded, with his ankle and ribs hurting, he found himself in a darkened room, his back against the porthole. In increasing pain, he managed to winch himself up to the door opening by using the handles. Lights were still on in the corridor when he got out. There was now no point in trying to find David and Sven. They would have to fend for themselves. Then he felt water seeping into his shoes. The decks below must already be flooded, including the one where his friends were sleeping. Cradling his ribs with his left arm, he gingerly stepped around the frames of the cabin doors, avoiding the gaping holes where the doors had swung open, and reached the stairwell, now askew. It was little more than a meter wide, and the angle was so acute that he was forced onto his knees. Clutching the handrail, he eased himself along as though he was wriggling through a shaft. In front of him was a frightened child being steered by a frantic mother. A man in underwear elbowed his way past them all, and the child slid backwards into Jens. He pushed them onwards, instinctively aware that every second counted. His engineer's brain was asking why the ship was going over so quickly. It should be righting itself by now. At the end of the stairwell, he staggered on, ignoring the screams and pleas around him. The ship's loudspeaker burst through the panic, and a woman's strained voice repeated the word, "Higher!" He didn't understand the Estonian. Then he found himself in an enormous space. It was the nightclub. He'd been in here on the trip over from Stockholm. Except now, the large dance floor had morphed into a mountain, its slope sheer and slippery. At the bottom, he was surrounded by debris, loose chairs, broken bottles and glasses, coffee cups and ashtrays, items of cast-off clothing, and people, unconscious, dazed, or dead. Anything that wasn't nailed down had slid into this gruesome abyss. Jens's strength was ebbing away. He was aware that his ribs were broken, and his shoulder and ankle were throbbing. He was an out-of-condition 54-year-old man, and the effort of getting this far had sapped his energy. Only adrenaline was keeping him going, and the thought that if he didn't make it up that slope, he'd never see Anita and Lasse again. He knew that the nightclub was on an upper deck, and there was an exit to the outside. Make the climb out of here, and he would be on the port side and well above the water. Then there would be a chance. Jens recognized his only hope was to use the floor-mounted tables as arm bars and foot jams, as though he was on a rock face. He couldn't do it slowly and methodically, as he didn't have the physical reserves left, or the time. The ship was creaking heavily. He must make a dash for it. With a yell to encourage himself, he launched his aching limbs at the nearest table, then on to the next. He could hardly breathe, and his body was doing its best to impede him, but he kept on going. He could now see the open door ahead of him in what was effectively the ceiling. Someone was hovering there. A hand waved encouragingly, and a voice called out. Jens didn't catch the words above the din. His feet were now on the legs of the penultimate table, and he reached up to the last one. The ship abruptly pitched back to port, and as he was thrown forward, he smashed his head against the corner of the final table. Within seconds, the vessel had resettled onto its starboard side. Dizzy from the impact, Jens lost his grip and tumbled back down the dance floor, ricocheting from table to table like a steel marble in a pinball machine. He crashed into the wreckage at the bottom. Then the lights flickered and went out. Chapter 1. The sea rippled gently against the sand. It was a calm day with a few fluffy clouds and a blue sky. Lilavik was at its most peaceful at that time of the morning. It was a working week and too early for the holidaymakers. The path running parallel to the beach still funneled the occasional jogger and dog walker, but Anita and Lasse had the sand to themselves. Lasse carried the plastic container in which lay the remains of his grandmother. Anita wasn't quite sure why her mother had wanted her ashes to be sprinkled in the sea at Lilavik. She hadn't been aware that it was a particularly special place for her. Certainly not the haven that Anita had cherished from her teenage years onwards. When she'd been told of the request by her aunt, who had lived with her mother in Kefranstad for the last 10 years, she'd wondered if it had anything to do with the fate of her father, who was lying somewhere at the bottom of the Baltic. Jens Ullman had been the love of her mother's life, and she'd never wanted anyone else after their marriage fell apart. Though there was no third party involved in the breakup, her mother had always remained bitter. And she took that bitterness out on Anita, who had adored her father and had remained close to him, especially when he was based in Stockholm and she was at the police academy there. His death in the MS Estonia ferry disaster had shattered Anita's world, and she had only been able to get through that terrible time because of her husband Bjorn's support. He'd been amazing. At that point, she hadn't been aware of his roving eye. And of course, there was young Lasse to keep her focused, though part of her sadness was that Lasse had never properly got to know his grandfather. He would never be taken fishing, or delight in Jens's offbeat sense of humor, marvel at his inventiveness and love of all things technical, be exposed to his passion for politics, or revel in his ability to spin a good yarn. That's how she remembered her father. Of course, she'd edited out all his negative character traits, the ones that had probably contributed to the family breakup. After his death, she'd compensated for the huge hole in her life by throwing herself into her work. Not for a moment had she stopped to think what losing Jens had meant to her mother, sad and lonely, unable to emotionally connect with her daughter and grandson. Anita had hoped that when Lasse's daughter Layla was born, her mother might involve herself more with her family. But it was only when Layla was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at the age of 2 that she had shown some compassion. That news had shocked them all, and caring for the little girl was a huge strain on Lasse and Yasmin. The grinding routine of sleepless nights and difficult days, constantly monitoring blood sugar levels, regulating diet and calculating insulin intake, enveloped them like a blanket through which no light could penetrate. But then, slowly, as they became accustomed to the routine, the darkness melted into shades of gray, and sometimes even pastel hues. And Layla's own strong character, tolerance and resilience was such an inspiration. Her eyes sparkled through it all, even though her little body was letting her down, and her moods often fluctuated. But despite her mother's concern for her great-granddaughter, Anita could never forgive her attitude towards Yasmin. Though Swedish-born, Lasse's partner was always an immigrant in her eyes, and she had never accepted her. Nevertheless, when her mother had been diagnosed with esophageal cancer, Anita had done the right thing. It took her 6 months to die, and during that time, Anita had traveled to Kefranstad as often as work allowed. Whatever resentments she harbored, and there were many, it was awful seeing her mother decline so swiftly. She'd organized the funeral, and she and Lasse had both given eulogies, though none of their words had rung particularly true. In the end, it was the recognition that their 50-year relationship had been such a waste that had upset Anita the most. Mother and daughter should have had a special bond. She envied her friends who had that closeness. The emotional connection had never really taken flight after the family's 2-year spell in England. That was the last time she remembered any real harmony. Maybe the fault was her own, Anita reflected. Not having enough empathy. Whatever. Now for the last rites. Anita hitched up her dress and tucked it into her belt. It wasn't very elegant with her knickers showing. She knew she should have hired a boat so that they could be more distant from the shore. Too late now. She took the plastic container from Lhasa and waded out into the shallows until the water came up over her knees. It was bloody cold even on a sunny, early July morning. She looked back at Lhasa. "Should I say a few words about your Mourning?" He shook his head. "You said it all at the funeral. Are you okay?" She felt faintly ridiculous. "Fine." Slowly, she unscrewed the lid and began to tip the ashes into the sea. She couldn't believe how much volume there was. Instead of a dainty sprinkle disappearing sedately into the water as she'd imagined, it all came out in a great, graceless whoosh. A lot of the ash was floating in what was fast becoming a gooey mess around her legs. She quickly tried to disperse it with her free hand. In mid-maneuver, her phone went off and shattered the fast-evaporating solemnity of the occasion. "Christ!" she muttered furiously. Not the time for a call. "Are you going to answer that, Mama?" Lhasa called from the beach. Anita threw the plastic container towards him to free up her hands. She hadn't realized that it still held a residue of her mother, which spilt out as it came to rest at the water's edge. She retrieved her phone. It was Hakim. He knew what she was doing today, honestly. "Sorry, Anita," Hakim put in immediately. "Hope this isn't a bad moment." It was. Her knees were surrounded by unsunken ash. Even in death, it was as though her mother was being critical. Anita couldn't even disperse her remains without getting it wrong. "What is it?" she snapped. "It's an attempted murder." "And?" "You're needed?" "No, I'm not. Surely to God you and Brode can sort it out." There was a nervous cough at the other end of the line.
Zetterberg insists you have to take charge."
"But she knows—" Of course. Alice Zetterberg knew why she was taking the day off. The bitch. This was yet another chance for her to make Anita's life as difficult as possible. There was no point taking it out on Hakim. "Right. SMS me the address and I'll see you in an hour." Anita glanced up at the sky and let out a loud expletive.
"Mama!"
called a horrified Lhasa.
"You shouldn't say that in front of more."
Chapter 2. An hour later, she reached the sheltered housing complex in Zetterberg, having dropped Lhasa off and cancelled the lunch she'd planned with her old Simrisam friend, Sandra. All the way back into town, she'd been mentally cursing Alice Zetterberg. Zetterberg had been their temporary boss now for nearly 2 years. This was frustrating for everyone. Eric Mauberry had been scheduled to return to his post after his heart attack. Complications had set in and his return had been delayed. Another couple of minor attacks hadn't helped. The Skåne County Police was still keeping his job open. This may have seemed altruistic, though in reality it was more to do with economics. Zetterberg was still head of the cold case group, as well as doubling up as acting head of their criminal investigation squad for the same salary. Mauberry was on half pay. It might be saving the force money, but was unsatisfactory for all concerned. The team desperately wanted Mauberry back, while Zetterberg had expected her role to become full-time. She'd envisaged a move up the career ladder, which she felt she deserved after assisting the security services 5 years before. The state of limbo didn't improve her temper or her attitude, and she took her frustration out on Anita whenever she could. The team's only respite from Zetterberg was when an important cold case emerged, and her attention was diverted. Fortunately, some of the year had seen Zetterberg working away from the Polishus, and with Chief Inspector Mauberry's return only a few weeks away, the team were looking to a brighter future. Zetterberg would soon be gone for good. Until then, she could still pull a few nasty strokes, like the summons this morning. Anita knew that was deliberate. Hakim was waiting for her at the door of the retirement apartment. Sympathy was written all over his face. "Don't say anything," Anita said, holding up a hand. Hakim followed her in.
"The kitchen,"
he said. She went through a tidy living room. It smelt like her aunt's house in Kefranstad, an old person's dwelling. Old furniture, old decor, old things, expensive old things. Everything was of good quality. The kitchen wasn't so tidy. The cooker and the wall above were spattered in blood, as though flicked from a paintbrush. There were great daubs of red on the linoleum floor. The instrument of all this carnage was obvious. A bloodied kitchen knife lay on the table.
"It's an old couple, Marcus and Nina Jolis,"
explained Hakim, who was still wearing latex gloves.
"Marcus attacked his wife with that."
He nodded at the knife.
"Amazingly, she's still alive. An ambulance took her off to hospital about 15 minutes ago. It'll be touch and go, and forensics are on their way."
"Where's the husband?"
"In the bedroom with B."
So Zetterberg had sent both Hakim and Erlandson to the scene of the crime, and yet had summoned Anita too. She was trying not to fume. She glanced around at the devastation. The crockery in the sink was all smashed. Some pieces littered the floor. "Who reported this?"
"He did."
"He did?"
"Yeah. Marcus Jolis. After he attacked his wife, he calmly rang the policehouse."
What bizarre behavior.
"I've already spoken to the warden. Naturally, she's horrified. When she'd got over her hysterics, she told me that the Jolises had been in here a couple of years. Devoted, apparently. He's 80 and she's 5 years younger. Nina is more of a carer these days. Marcus has Alzheimer's. He's been getting steadily worse. He often lost his temper. Nina usually managed to settle him down. This time, obviously, she didn't succeed. Anything might have set him off."
"The washing up?" Anita speculated as she surveyed the sink. Hakim shrugged.
"He doesn't remember much, apparently, though he has the odd lucid moment. Might explain the phone call."
There was a ring at the door.
"Probably forensics."
Hakim disappeared, leaving Anita to take in the scene. Thank goodness her mother hadn't succumbed to dementia. Small mercies. It wasn't Yeva Tulun who appeared at the door. Young Lars Unnason bounced into the room. He hadn't Yeva's worldly-wise cynicism and caustic humor that Anita so enjoyed. He was like a puppy which had just been let off its leash. His enthusiasm was as infectious as it was tiring. Each crime scene was an exciting new playroom, and he had the technical toys to keep him happy. "No Yeva?"
"On a holiday. Somewhere quiet and sunny. Said she'd found a place where there were no distractions for her husband except her. Reckoned she hadn't been getting enough sex lately."
"That sounds like Yeva. Well, I'll leave you in peace." Unnason scoped the room with his forensic eye.
"No body?"
He was almost disappointed. "She's still alive, but treat it as a murder scene. It may become one."
"Okie dokie."
Anita entered the bedroom. Again, it was neat. Nina Jolis liked to keep a pristine home. Not that Anita really took in the surroundings. It was Marcus Jolis who was the center of her attention. He was sitting on the double bed, head bowed. He dwarfed the petite B. Erlandson, who was sitting next to him. She stood up when Anita entered. By the windows stood a uniformed officer. Erlandson wasn't taking any chances. Jolis might turn violent again. "He's not really saying anything," said Erlandson, "except he keeps asking for his wife." Anita took the place on the bed that B had just vacated. Marcus Jolis was wearing a blue dressing gown that was covered in dried blood. His cupped hands were also streaked in red from the attack. His gray hair was thinning. He was unshaven with a couple of days' growth. His most prominent feature was his large ears. They would be cartoonish if the circumstances weren't so tragic. "Marcus," Anita spoke softly, "can you tell me what happened here this morning? With Nina? He continued to stare silently at his hands. Nina's gone to hospital. He slowly turned to Anita. For a moment his brown eyes flickered with fear.
Why has Nina gone to hospital?
She was hurt.
Hurt?
Do you remember anything? Do you remember calling the police? He shook his head in bewilderment. Anita glanced up at Erlandson. She gave a shrug in return. Better let Lars have a quick look at him than get him cleaned up. He'll have to be assessed before anything else can be done. With the help of the uniformed officer, Erlandson gently eased up the bulky Marcus Jolis and took him out of the bedroom. Anita went to the window. The gardens consisted of a pleasant lawn and bright flower-covered borders. A gray-haired lady sat on a bench, gazing at nothing in particular. Old age was something Anita dreaded. Not being old itself, but the infirmities that might come with it. Losing her memory was her biggest fear. Already she was absent-minded. Lasse teased her about it. Maybe she'd become more conscious of it since turning 50 last year. To distract herself from her morbid thoughts, she started to examine the room. Or to be more precise, the photographs on the walls. Children, grandchildren, smiling faces all around. How would they take the news of the attack? There was Marcus presiding over a barbecue, Nina at a park with young kids, an excited family group opening presents at Christmas. The only picture that seemed unrelated was one of a much younger Marcus in a Tullavarket uniform. He had obviously been in the Swedish customs. Years of service and respectability had come to this. Chapter 3. He tapped his desktop impatiently. He had so much to do today that this call was an inconvenience, albeit a rather important one.
Yes, I saw it in the newspapers. It's nothing to be concerned about.
It had given him a jolt, if he were honest. After thinking about it, he realized that it shouldn't be a problem, but it had been flagged up, hence the call.
Are you sure? I can't see any difficulties.
There was silence at the other end of the line. The caller wasn't convinced.
All we have to do is keep an eye on things,
he said, trying to sound reassuring. Why the hell was he being bothered by this? Maybe he should take the initiative. He didn't really want them getting involved.
Look, do you want to monitor this situation, or do you want my people to handle it?
After a pause,
I think it's best if I leave it to you.
He smiled. He knew that would be the answer.
Fine. It'll be strictly softly.
Good. Another pause. This was annoying. The man was a puppy. His predecessors had not been so mealy-mouthed. They'd been stronger, more resolute, tougher by far.
You'll keep me updated? Of course.
He put the phone down before there were any further quibbles. He tapped his desk again, not impatiently, but thoughtfully. Then, after a couple more minutes of contemplation, he knew exactly whom he was going to call. At least they would know what they were doing. It's awful, really. Sad. I haven't had a chance to talk to him again over the last couple of days. His wife is still in intensive care, and they're not sure she's going to pull through. Anita was sitting on her bed, FaceTiming Kevin Ashe, her long-distance British boyfriend and fellow detective based in the north of England. They communicated most Sundays when their respective shifts allowed. Anita had expected Kevin's enthusiasm eventually to wane, especially after she'd turned down his hasty marriage proposal 2 years earlier, which, at the time, almost ended their relationship. But the opposite had happened, and he seemed to love her all the more. Maybe it was a case of absence making the heart grow fonder. It made her all the more anxious whenever they hooked up that she might not match up to the idealized image of her that Kevin kept in his head when they were apart. So far, she'd passed each test, despite the fact that she was increasingly aware that she no longer had her youthful looks. She looked down at her tummy, which was looser than she liked, and felt grateful that her glasses were a distraction from the lines on her face, which was why she was wearing them now, even though she was still in bed with her third cup of coffee of the—
Sample complete. Ready to continue?